Right, moving right along, as I had said in the preceding video, going over some of the speculations and rumours that have come up involving the clue Malcolm. I have been covering many potential Malcolms that could be the Malcolm in question in discussing the situation involving these clues. So, the Malcolm in question. I've discussed many Malcolms with you who are potential, and now I shall continue with some more Malcolms for your consideration. There's the character. Now, so where did I leave off? Oh, there it was. There is the actor Christopher Malcolm. Yes, Malcolm can also be a surname. It can be a middle name. It can be a first name. It doesn't have to be the first name only. Right. Christopher Malcolm, the actor who appeared in the Star Wars films playing one of the rebel pilots that were one of the ones that I don't know if it was Wedge. It wasn't Wedge, was it? I forget which one it was. But it was one of those rebel pilots that was fighting against the Empire. You didn't really pay too much attention to them because you're interested in what Luke is doing, of course. But he was in these films. But he also was the very first actor to play Brad Majors. Asshole! Yes, Brad Majors on the Rocky Horror Show in its original presentation in London back in the early 70s. So that's quite significant, perhaps, or maybe not, but it needs to be mentioned. And then there's a very intriguing Malcolm you may not have heard of, Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson. That's Wheeler-Nicholson. Well, that sounds quite British. He was from Tennessee. He was American. Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson was a veteran of wars, and heroic in person and adventurer in many ways, had quite a colourful life. But then he went to New York City and got into publishing. And he invented a form of publication that has been quite significant to popular culture. There's some people had actually been taking newspaper comic strips and putting them in little magazines and publishing these sort of comic books already. Max Gaines, I think, was the first one to do that. It was called Famous Funnies. But Major Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson was the one who thought about having original content in these books, not just republishing what had already been seen in newspapers. And he came up with, he founded a company called National Allied Publications, which eventually became National Periodical Publications, which is DC Comics, in other words. The founder of DC Comics, and he came up with a comic book called New Fun Comics, because they were new, you see. New Fun Comics. And they contained all original stories written just for being published for the first time, not something taken out of a newspaper, which had been done before. And so because of that, he is considered to be the founder of the American comic book. So all of you who are fans of Spider-Man, Superman, and any Batman or any other character, you can tip your hat to Major Wheeler Nicholson, because he's the guy who came up with the whole thing way back in the early 20th century. And so there's a Malcolm that could be significant there. And then, of course, we have Malcolm Long, speaking of comics. Malcolm Long, a comic book character. He was Rorschach's therapist in the Watchmen books. So he might have something to do with this. And then there's another doctor, Malcolm Betruger. Malcolm Betruger, yes, a villainous character in the video game Doom 3, who eventually becomes a rather demonic entity himself. And then there's another comic book character named Malcolm, Malcolm Duncan, better known simply as Mal back in the day, who was one of the members of the Teen Titans, the junior Justice League team made up of their former sidekicks. In the 1970s, Mal, simply known as Mal, was one of the members, one of the few that was not a sidekick, and one of the very first African-American superheroes in the DC universe. Mal had a sort of shofar horn that was given to him by none other than the Archangel Gabriel himself, and when he blew it, portals would open and things would happen. Later on, after the Crisis and after various other reboots of continuity, as I understand it, most recently he is called Vox, and he doesn't have the horn anymore, but he actually has technology built into his body that gives him powers similar to the ones he had when he blew the horn. Continuity, I don't know if he ever was the character he used to be, because sometimes the whole reality has retroactively shifted, what they call retconning, and I haven't kept up with all of that. But I remember Malcolm the way he was in the 70s when I read Teen Titans as a lad, but I don't know what it's like now exactly. But I know he's still around. He's called Vox now. And then there's another one called Malcolm Young. This isn't a comic book. This is a real person. Malcolm Young is, I believe, the bass guitar player for AC/DC, the Australian heavy metal band of great renown. It's Australian, isn't it? I think so. Of course, his younger brother Angus Young is the lead guitar, the one that gets the most press as he bounces around in his schoolboy outfit. But Malcolm's back there and is a powerful performer nonetheless. And it must be remembered, AC/DC, of course, was the soundtrack to Maximum Overdrive. I have to throw that in there for my friend Heather, because that's would excite her. Then, of course, we have, let's see, who's the other Malcolms? God, I'm getting old. I need to get bifocals one of these days instead of sliding my glasses down my nose. Let's see. Oh, yes. There's Malcolm, who is the protagonist of a film which has been known by various titles. It was been released overseas as Malcolm. The title was also called Charm, and the original title was called Random Acts of Violence, a sort of film that has elements of A Clockwork Orange and American Psycho, reportedly. I've not seen it, of course. I'm not even sure it's been released officially, but it's a horror film about disaffected youth in New York City with a gun killing people. That Malcolm is played by Ashley Cahill, and it probably is something, just to bring it up, there is a Malcolm film. There is also the character of Malcolm, played by Stephen Lord, in the ABC television's fantasy series Once Upon a Time, who turned out to be the father of Rumpelstiltskin, and also, strangely enough, is Peter Pan, portrayed in this sort of deconstructed way as a villain on the series. So that could be significant there, as the actor who plays Rumpelstiltskin, Robbie, oh damn, I can't remember his last name. He's Scottish. As he said, how could a guy named Malcolm name his kid Rumpelstiltskin? It just doesn't, anyway. But all right. Then there's Malcolm Black. Who's Malcolm Black? Well, there really wasn't a Malcolm Black. That was just a name that appeared on the emails of Willow's internet boyfriend, before she realized she liked girls, on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, in a very early episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer called I, Robot, You, Jane. If you recall, a demon named Murloc the Corruptor had been cast into a scroll. His physical corporeal form being annihilated, his spirit was entrapped in a scroll. Willow found the scroll and transcribed it onto her computer, scanned it on her computer, and when that happened, the spirit of the demon actually got into the internet, you see, and it began to send her messages and emails. He had no physical form, but he was now a sort of ghost in the machine, to speak of it. And he began sending her emails posing as a teenage boy named Malcolm Black. And so Willow had an internet boyfriend that she never met. And everyone was, the other Scoobies were like saying, that might not be a good idea, but she was convinced Malcolm was a good guy, and ultimately bad led to worse, and Moloch manifested as in a mechanical body as a sort of robot before Buffy defeated him. Or he was defeated. I forget exactly how it happened. Willow may have had to been involved in the actual defeating, although she wasn't a witch yet. Not full on yet. This was an early episode program. So Malcolm Black then was referenced in Buffy the Vampire Slayer as an alias for Moloch the Corruptor. Now, other Malcolms. Malcolm Shields. Who's Malcolm Shields? Well, he passed away, I believe, recently. But he was an actor who, among other things, the character, I mentioned the actor who played Rumpelstiltskin. He's also known, that actor who played Rumpelstiltskin, Carlyle, that's the name. Yes, Robert Carlyle, I think that's right. He played Begbie in Trainspotting, if you recall. And on stage, Begbie was first played on stage in a very different Scottish play by Malcolm Shields. So there's a Malcolm there. So could it be a reference to the worst toilet in Scotland? I don't know. Maybe. Then there's Malcolm Landgrab. I have to bring him up. The villain of many different incarnations has appeared in many different variations of the video game Sims. So let's mention Malcolm Landgrab. And then we have Malcolm Krell, Dr. Malcolm Krell. And that is the protagonist of the motion picture The Sixth Sense. Malcolm Krell, played by Bruce Willis, who has a patient who sees dead people, and without understanding the full connotations of the fact that his patient sees dead people until he figures it out at the end of the movie. So that could be quite significant, because that could lead to all sorts of Shyamalan-type twists in other films by Shyamalan that might be significant, perhaps. And then when I thought of, whilst working on these videos, I mentioned Bob, and Bob reminded me of Twin Peaks, and I suddenly recalled there was a Malcolm on the second season of Twin Peaks. Yes, Malcolm Sloan, who was the nefarious fellow who, with his girlfriend, tried to frame James Hurley for murder. So that was a character that he was played by an actor named, I think it was Nicholas something. Never mind, that's probably not that important, but you can look it up. Anyway, Malcolm Sloan was the name of the character. So that's a Malcolm from Twin Peaks, so that's a connotation there too. So all of these Malcolms, so many Malcolms, so many potential Malcolms. So, the first video, but in the title of this video I promised you something. How much time? I think I can do it. Now, taking these Malcolms, they are not direct references to whatever the house or maze is going to be. As someone pointed out last year, the Walking Dead clue was John. How did John mean the Walking Dead? Murdy's clue John meant John equals Johnny Cash, the performer who did a song called Folsom City Blues and also performed at prisons. And so prison was to match the prison set scenario in the third season of Walking Dead. That's how you got from John to The Walking Dead. So Malcolm will go to whatever the house is in the same way. It's not going to be Malcolm direct reference to the house. Malcolm McDowell was in Cat People, therefore it's a Cat People house. That's not the way it works. You have to figure out how Malcolm applies to something, and that something fits in with something at the house in a different way than just directly. The same way John got you to The Walking Dead. That's what we have to do. So, all these different Malcolms, which one could it be, and how does that eventually lead you to the house? That's the problem. Well, I think I may have come upon the solution. But now I have to put that into part 3. Damn you, Dr. Jimmy!